Karen Thompson had always been the kind of person who didn't hold back. Whether it was voicing her opinion at work, arguing with customer service reps over the phone, or even debating strangers online, she thrived on making herself heard. Her friends often joked that Karen could start a conversation with a wall and win. So when she and her husband, Mark, planned their dream vacation to London, everyone expected Karen to bring her bold personality along for the ride. And boy, did she ever. The couple landed in London on a crisp spring morning, greeted by the buzz of taxis honking and the sight of Big Ben towering against the skyline. Karen was giddy with excitement. She had dreamed of visiting this city since she was a kid, watching movies about royalty and imagining herself strolling through grand palaces. Now here she was, ready to soak up every ounce of British charm, or so she thought. Their first stop, Buckingham Palace, the iconic home of the royal family. As they joined a group of tourists outside the gates, Karen couldn't help but marvel at the scene before her. The palace stood majestically behind its iron fence, surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens. But what really caught Karen's eye were the royal guards standing post nearby. Clad in their striking red tunics and towering bearskin hats, they looked like statues come to life. Their faces were blank, their bodies unmoving, as if carved from stone. A tour guide nearby explained how these guards followed strict rules. No talking, no smiling, no reacting, no matter what happened. Karen listened half-heartedly, more intrigued by the challenge than the history lesson. No reaction. She whispered to Mark with a mischievous grin. "We'll see about that." Mark rolled his eyes, knowing exactly where this was going. He'd seen this side of Karen before, the one that loved pushing boundaries just to see what would happen. "Don't even think about it," he warned playfully, though deep down, he knew better than to expect her to listen. As the crowd shuffled closer to the guards, Karen noticed other tourists testing the limits too. Some waved their hands wildly in front of the guards' faces, while others struck silly poses for photos. Not once did the guards flinch. Karen chuckled at their antics, feeling a spark of curiosity ignite within her. What would it take to break their stoic demeanor? Could she be the one to finally crack the code? Her mind raced with ideas. Maybe a loud noise, or a clever insult. No, those seemed too boring. She needed something bigger, bolder, something only Karen Thompson would dare to try. Little did she know, her growing determination was about to lead her down a path she'd never imagined. For now, though, she simply smiled to herself, clutching her purse tightly as she plotted her next move. After all, Karen wasn't the type to let an opportunity pass her by, not when there was fun, and maybe a little chaos, to be had. Karen's first night in jail was unlike anything she had ever experienced. The cell was small, cold, and smelled faintly of disinfectant. A single metal bed frame with a thin mattress stood against one wall, while a tiny barred window let in just enough light to remind her of the world outside. A world that suddenly felt impossibly far away. She sat on the edge of the bed, hugging her knees to her chest, trying to process how drastically her life had changed in just 48 hours. The other inmates weren't exactly welcoming. When Karen introduced herself hesitantly during mealtime, they immediately recognized her face from the news. "Oh, you're the pepper spray queen." One woman cackled, drawing laughter from the others. Karen forced a weak smile, but felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. For the next 2 weeks, she became the subject of endless jokes and teasing. Some called her Royal Wrecker, while others sarcastically asked if she planned to bring down the monarchy next. It was humiliating, but Karen knew she deserved it. Every snide comment served as a reminder of her poor choices. Despite the ridicule, Karen found moments of quiet reflection. At night, when the chatter died down and the fluorescent lights dimmed, she lay awake replaying the events that led her here. She thought about the guard whose stoic demeanor she had so carelessly mocked. What must he have been thinking when she pulled out the pepper spray? Did he feel disrespected? Threatened? Angry? She realized she had never stopped to consider his perspective, or anyone else's. before acting. Her impulsiveness wasn't just reckless, it was selfish. During her second week, Karen began writing letters. First, she wrote to the royal family, apologizing for her behavior and expressing regret for tarnishing the dignity of their guards. Then, she penned a heartfelt note to the specific guard involved, thanking him for his professionalism despite her provocation. Finally, she wrote to Mark, pouring out her emotions onto paper. "I've learned more about myself in these 2 weeks than I have in years," she confessed. "I hope you can forgive me for dragging you into this mess." Her time in jail also gave her a new appreciation for freedom and responsibility. She watched as other inmates shared stories of their own mistakes, some far more serious than hers. Many spoke bitterly about missed opportunities and broken relationships. Karen realized how lucky she was to have a supportive husband waiting for her on the outside. Unlike many of the women around her, she still had a chance to rebuild her life, if she chose to use it wisely. On her final day, as Karen prepared to leave the facility, the warden handed her a small envelope containing copies of her letters. "These are proof that you're taking this seriously," he said gruffly. "Don't waste them." Karen nodded, clutching the envelope tightly as she stepped back into the sunlight. Breathing fresh air again felt like a gift, one she promised herself she'd never take for granted. Mark greeted her outside, holding up a sign that read, "Welcome back, Karen, but no more pepper spray." Despite everything, Karen laughed through her tears. For the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope. Jail hadn't been easy, but it had taught her something invaluable. Actions have consequences, and redemption starts with owning your mistakes. As they walked away together, Karen vowed to carry that lesson with her, not just for the next 5 years, but for the rest of her life. The next morning, Karen woke up with a mischievous glint in her eye. She had spent the entire night replaying the scene from Buckingham Palace in her mind, imagining ways to get a reaction out of those unshakable royal guards. By the time breakfast rolled around, she had convinced herself that it was practically her duty as a tourist to test their limits. "What's the harm?" she told Mark over coffee. "It's not like they're going to arrest me for having a little fun." Mark groaned, already regretting agreeing to visit the palace again. "Karen, please don't do anything stupid," he pleaded, but his words fell on deaf ears. Karen was already halfway out the door, camera slung around her neck, and a confident bounce in her step. When they arrived at Buckingham Palace, the crowd was even bigger than the day before. Tourists from all over the world jostled for space near the gates, eager to catch a glimpse of the famous guards. Karen scanned the area, zeroing in on one particular guard who stood slightly apart from the others. His posture was impeccable, his expression unreadable, and his towering hat made him look almost comical. Perfect, Karen thought with a smirk. She started small, snapping photos from a distance while laughing loudly and making exaggerated faces at the guard. But just like the day before, he didn't so much as blink. Frustrated but undeterred, Karen decided to step things up. She moved closer until she was practically standing right in front of him, waving her hands dramatically and pretending to sneeze directly into his face. Still nothing. The crowd around her began to notice Karen's antics. Some laughed nervously, while others shook their heads in disapproval. A few kids even mimicked her movements, trying to get the guard to crack a smile. But the guard remained as still as ever, his gaze fixed straight ahead. Karen's competitive streak kicked in. How could someone possibly ignore her like this? It felt personal now, like the guard was silently mocking her inability to rattle them. Determined to win, she leaned in even closer, pointing her camera inches away from his face. "Come on, buddy," she said loudly, drawing stares from nearby tourists. "You can't tell me you're not dying to laugh right now." Still no response. The guard might as well have been carved from marble. Feeling increasingly irritated, and more than a little embarrassed, Karen reached into her purse. That's when she spotted it, the small bottle of pepper spray she always carried for safety. An idea formed in her mind, one that seemed harmless enough at first. What if she pretended to wave the spray near his face? Surely that would get some kind of reaction, right? It wasn't like she'd actually use it, or so she told herself. Without giving it another thought, Karen pulled out the bottle and held it up theatrically, pretending to threaten the guard. She grinned, expecting him to finally break character and scold her, or at least look annoyed. Instead, something unexpected happened. The guard stepped forward suddenly, breaking his rigid stance, and raised his hand to signal for backup. Within seconds, two other guards appeared, their expressions serious and focused. Karen froze, her grin fading as reality sunk in. This wasn't part of the plan. People around her gasped, and cameras clicked furiously as palace security descended on the scene. For the first time in her life, Karen realized she might have gone too far. Her heart raced as she tried to laugh it off, insisting it was just a joke. But the stern faces surrounding her made it clear that no one was amused, not in the slightest. Back in the United States, Karen's return wasn't the triumphant homecoming she had once imagined for her vacation. Instead, it felt like stepping into a spotlight she never wanted. News of her sentencing and jail time had made its way across the Atlantic, turning her into both a punchline and a cautionary tale. Friends who hadn't spoken to her in years suddenly reached out, not to offer support, but to ask if the pepper spray story was really true. Strangers recognized her at the grocery store or coffee shop, whispering behind their hands as she passed by. For weeks, Karen avoided leaving the house, overwhelmed by shame and the fear of being judged. But staying hidden wasn't an option forever. Slowly, Karen began to face the world again, determined to turn her experience into something meaningful. She started attending local community meetings, listening quietly as people discussed issues like cultural sensitivity, responsible tourism, and personal accountability. At first, she kept her identity to herself, afraid of how others might react. But one evening, during a discussion about respecting global traditions, Karen decided to speak up. "I'm not proud of what I did," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly as all eyes turned to her. "I acted without thinking, and I hurt people, not physically, but emotionally. I disrespected something important, and I paid the price for it." The room fell silent as she continued. "What happened to me shouldn't happen to anyone else. We need to be better travelers, better listeners, and better humans." Her honesty struck a chord with the group. Some attendees expressed sympathy, while others shared their own stories of cultural misunderstandings and lessons learned. By the end of the meeting, several people approached Karen to thank her for speaking so openly. It was a small step, but it gave her hope that she could start rebuilding her reputation, not as the woman who pepper-sprayed a royal guard, but as someone committed to growth and change. Encouraged by the response, Karen took things further. She began volunteering at a local community center, teaching workshops on cultural awareness and responsible travel. Using her own experience as a case study, she emphasized the importance of understanding laws, customs, and boundaries when visiting foreign countries. "You don't have to agree with everything," she often said, "but you do have to respect it." The workshops gained traction quickly, drawing participants of all ages eager to learn from Karen's mistakes. Parents brought their kids, hoping to instill values of empathy and responsibility early on. College students preparing for study abroad programs attended to gain practical advice. Even seasoned travelers joined in, curious to hear Karen's unique perspective. Still, not everyone was forgiving. Online trolls continued to mock her, posting cruel memes and comments whenever her name resurfaced. One day, while scrolling through social media, Karen came across a particularly harsh post calling her the worst tourist ever. Her instinct was to lash out in defense, but instead, she paused and reminded herself of the lessons she'd learned. She deleted the app and focused on what truly mattered, making amends and moving forward. As months passed, Karen noticed subtle changes within herself. She became more patient, more thoughtful, and less quick to judge others. Conversations that once would have frustrated her now sparked curiosity rather than anger. Mark noticed the shift too, telling her one evening, "You're different now, in a good way." His words meant the world to her. Though the scars of her past mistake remained, both personally and publicly, Karen embraced them as reminders of how far she'd come. She knew she couldn't erase what had happened, nor did she want to. Instead, she chose to let it shape her into someone stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. And deep down, she hoped that sharing her story might help others avoid the same pitfalls she had stumbled into. As palace security closed in, Karen's mind raced faster than her heart. One moment, she was joking around, convinced she was just having harmless fun. The next, she found herself surrounded by stern-faced guards and officials who looked like they meant business. Her laughter faltered, replaced by a nervous giggle that sounded more awkward than convincing. It was just a joke, she blurted out, holding up her hands as if to prove she wasn't dangerous. But no one seemed interested in her explanation. The crowd of tourists, once entertained by her antics, now watched silently, their expressions ranging from shock to disapproval. Some parents pulled their children closer, whispering warnings about respecting authority. Others whipped out their phones, eager to capture the unfolding drama on video. Karen felt her cheeks burn as she realized how quickly the situation had spiraled out of control. What had started as an attempt to lighten the mood now felt like something far more serious. A tall officer with a clipboard approached her, his tone calm but firm. "Ma'am, please come with us," he said, gesturing toward a nearby entrance to the palace grounds. Karen hesitated, glancing back at Mark, who stood frozen a few feet away, looking both horrified and helpless. "Mark," she called out, hoping he'd step in and somehow fix this mess. But before he could respond, another guard stepped between them, blocking his path. "Sir, you'll need to stay here," the guard said firmly, leaving no room for argument. Mark opened his mouth to protest but thought better of it, realizing there was nothing he could do. Instead, he watched helplessly as Karen was escorted away, her confident demeanor crumbling with each step. Once inside the palace grounds, Karen was taken to a small holding room. It was plain and functional, with gray walls and a single table in the center. 2 officers joined her, asking her to empty her pockets and hand over her belongings. Karen complied reluctantly, placing her phone, wallet, and the infamous bottle of pepper spray on the table. As she did, she couldn't help but feel a pang of regret. Why hadn't she just left well enough alone? What had possessed her to pull out the pepper spray, even as a joke? The questioning began almost immediately. One officer asked for her name, passport details, and reason for visiting the UK, while the other scribbled notes on a pad. Karen answered truthfully, though her voice wavered as she explained herself. "I didn't mean any harm," she insisted, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I thought it would be funny. I wasn't actually going to use it. I swear." Her protests fell flat. The officers exchanged knowing glances, their expressions unreadable. They explained that bringing pepper spray into a restricted area like Buckingham Palace was a serious offense under British law. Even carrying it casually could land her in trouble, let alone brandishing it near a royal guard. Karen's stomach sank as she realized the gravity of her mistake. Back home, pepper spray was seen as a common self-defense tool, something many people carried without thinking twice. Here, it was classified as an offensive weapon, a fact she hadn't considered until now. Time seemed to drag on endlessly as the officers reviewed security footage and discussed the incident among themselves. Karen sat quietly, her earlier bravado completely gone. For the first time in her life, she felt truly powerless. Every sound, the shuffle of papers, the click of pens, the occasional murmur of voices outside, made her flinch. She couldn't stop replaying the events in her head, wondering how everything had gone so wrong so fast. Finally, one of the officers turned to her, his expression grim. "Miss Thompson, you're being detained pending further investigation," he said. "This is a very serious matter, and will need to involve higher authorities." His words hit Karen like a punch to the gut. Detained. Higher authorities. This wasn't supposed to happen. It was just a silly prank, Or at least, that's what she kept telling herself. Yet, deep down, she knew there was no way to undo what she had done. Whatever consequences awaited her, she would have to face them head-on. Months turned into a year, and Karen's life slowly began to settle into a new rhythm. The viral headlines about her infamous trip to London had faded, replaced by newer, shinier stories that captured the internet's fleeting attention. But for Karen, the memory of those 2 weeks in jail, and everything that followed, remained vivid. It wasn't something she could easily forget, nor did she want to. Every time she stepped outside or interacted with someone, she carried the weight of her past actions as a quiet reminder to think before she acted. Her workshops at the community center became her passion project, drawing larger crowds than she ever expected. What started as a small gathering of curious locals had grown into a full-fledged program endorsed by local schools and travel organizations. Karen even partnered with a nonprofit focused on global education, helping create materials for travelers heading abroad. Her message was simple yet powerful: respect matters. Whether it's respecting laws, traditions, or people, taking the time to understand and honor differences can prevent unnecessary conflict, and sometimes life-altering mistakes. Despite her progress, there were still moments when Karen felt the sting of her old reputation. Occasionally, someone would recognize her name or face and make a snarky comment. Once, while giving a presentation at a library, a man in the back interrupted her mid-sentence. "Aren't you the woman who got arrested for pepper spraying a guard?" he asked loudly, smirking. The room fell silent, and for a brief moment, Karen felt the familiar flush of embarrassment creep up her neck. But instead of shrinking away, she smiled calmly and nodded. "Yes, I am," she replied, her voice steady. "And trust me, I've spent every day since then learning from my mistake. That's why I'm here, to help others avoid making the same one." The audience erupted into applause, and the man sank back into his seat, looking sheepish. In that moment, Karen realized just how much she had changed. She no longer ran from her past. She owned it, using it as a tool to connect with others and inspire change. Mark noticed the transformation too. Gone was the impulsive, quick-tempered Karen who always had to have the last word. In her place was someone more thoughtful and grounded, someone who listened before speaking and considered consequences before acting. Their relationship grew stronger because of it, built on mutual respect and a shared commitment to learning from challenges. One evening, as they sat together on their porch watching the sunset, Mark turned to Karen with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever wish none of this had happened?" he asked softly. Karen hesitated, staring out at the horizon. It was a question she'd asked herself countless times over the past year. At first, her answer had been an emphatic yes. Who wouldn't want to erase such a humiliating chapter from their life? But now, as she looked back on everything she had gained, a deeper sense of empathy, a renewed purpose, and a chance to make a positive impact, her perspective had shifted. "No," she said finally, surprising even herself. "I mean, I wish I hadn't done what I did, obviously. But if it hadn't happened, I don't think I'd be where I am today. I wouldn't have learned how important it is to slow down, listen, and take responsibility for my actions." Mark smiled, reaching over to squeeze her hand. "That's growth, Karen. Real growth." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Karen felt a rare sense of peace. Life after the incident hadn't been easy, but it had been meaningful. She knew she couldn't undo the past, nor could she control what others thought of her. What she could do, however, was keep moving forward, with humility, grace, and a determination to leave the world better than she found it. And so, Karen Thompson, the woman once known as the Pepper Spray Queen, continued to rebuild her life, one lesson at a time. Her story wasn't perfect, but it was real. And in its imperfection, it offered something far more valuable. A reminder that even our biggest mistakes can lead to our greatest opportunities, if we're willing to learn from them. By the time Karen stepped into the courtroom the next morning, Her nerves were frayed to the breaking point. The room was small but imposing, with dark wooden benches and a raised platform where the judge sat. A few members of the public had gathered to watch, curious about the American tourist who had made headlines for her bizarre run-in with a royal guard. Reporters scribbled notes in the corner, their cameras clicking softly as Karen took her seat beside a court-appointed lawyer. She felt like everyone's eyes were on her, judging her every move. Her lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Ms. Harper, leaned over to whisper instructions. "Just answer honestly and keep your emotions in check," she advised. "This is serious, but if you show remorse, it might work in your favor." Karen nodded, trying to steady her breathing. She had spent the night replaying the incident in her mind, imagining all the ways she could have avoided this mess. Now, sitting here under the weight of the law, she realized just how reckless she'd been. The prosecutor presented the case first, laying out the evidence against Karen in clear, unemotional terms. He described how she had ignored repeated warnings about respecting the guards' roles, escalated her behavior despite obvious boundaries, and ultimately committed an act that violated British law. When he mentioned the pepper spray, his tone hardened. "This isn't just a prank gone wrong," he said firmly. "It's a deliberate disregard for our laws and institutions." Karen winced at the word deliberate. That wasn't how she saw it at all. To her, it had been a spur-of-the-moment decision, fueled by frustration and a desire to provoke a reaction. But hearing it framed this way made her actions sound calculated and malicious, two things she knew she wasn't. When it was her turn to speak, Karen stood nervously, clutching the edge of the witness stand. Her voice trembled as she began. "I never meant to hurt anyone or cause trouble," she said, looking directly at the judge. "I thought I was being funny, trying to lighten the mood. I didn't know pepper spray was illegal here. I promise I didn't mean any harm." The judge listened patiently, but didn't soften his expression. When Karen finished speaking, he addressed her directly. "Miss Thompson," he said, his voice measured but firm, "your intentions may not have been malicious, but your actions were reckless and disrespectful. Our royal guards are symbols of tradition and duty, and they deserve respect from everyone, including tourists. What you did undermined that." Karen nodded quickly, tears welling up in her eyes. "I understand now," she said, her voice cracking. "I'm so sorry. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." After a brief deliberation, the judge delivered his verdict. Karen was found guilty of both charges: possession of an offensive weapon in a restricted area and assaulting a royal guard. As punishment, she was sentenced to 2 weeks in jail, fined several £1,000s, and banned from re-entering the UK for 5 years. The courtroom fell silent as the sentence was announced. Karen's heart sank. Jail. A travel ban. This was worse than she'd imagined. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed her, thrusting microphones in her face and shouting questions. "Do you regret your actions?" one asked. "What do you think of the sentence?" another pressed. Karen kept her head down, letting Mark guide her through the crowd. Once they reached a quiet spot, she collapsed onto a bench, overwhelmed by shame and regret. "How did this happen?" she whispered, more to herself than to Mark. Word of her sentencing spread quickly online, sparking heated debates across social media. Some people mocked her, calling her entitled and clueless. Others defended her, arguing that the punishment was too harsh for what amounted to a harmless prank. Memes featuring Karen's face popped up everywhere, turning her into an internet sensation. For all the wrong reasons. Despite the ridicule, Karen couldn't deny that she deserved some of the criticism. Sitting there on the bench, staring at the pavement, she realized just how much damage her impulsiveness had caused. Not only had she embarrassed herself, but she had also tarnished her reputation and put her family through unnecessary stress. For the first time in her life, Karen truly understood the importance of thinking before acting and the heavy price of failing to do so. Karen sat in the small holding room, her mind spinning with thoughts of what might happen next. The initial shock had worn off, leaving behind a gnawing sense of dread. She tried to convince herself that this was all just a big misunderstanding, that surely no one would throw someone in jail for a harmless joke. But as the minutes ticked by and the reality of her situation sank in, Karen began to realize just how much trouble she was in. The officers returned after what felt like hours, though it was probably only 20 minutes. One of them carried a folder filled with papers, while the other held a phone. "Miss Thompson," the taller officer said, his tone formal but not unkind, "we've reviewed the footage and spoken with the guard involved. We're going to need you to answer some additional questions." Karen nodded nervously, clutching the edge of the table for support. Her hands were clammy, and her throat felt dry. "Okay," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. The officer placed the phone on the table and pressed play. Suddenly, Karen found herself staring at grainy yet unmistakable video footage of her own actions, waving her hands wildly, leaning too close to the guard, and finally pulling out the pepper spray. Seeing it all replayed back made her cringe. It looked so much worse on camera than it had in the moment. "Can you explain why you brought this item into a restricted area?" the officer asked, pointing to the pepper spray sitting on the table. Karen swallowed hard, searching for the right words. I carry it for safety," she stammered. "Back home, it's totally normal. I didn't think it was a big deal." The officer raised an eyebrow. In the UK, carrying such items is considered possession of an offensive weapon unless you have specific authorization, which you clearly do not. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in before continuing, and brandishing it near a royal guard. "That escalates things significantly." Karen's heart sank. She wanted to argue, to explain that she hadn't meant any harm, but the look on the officer's face told her it wouldn't make a difference. They weren't interested in excuses. They were focused on facts. Slowly, she nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I swear, I didn't mean to cause trouble." Her confession did little to soften the seriousness of the situation. After another round of questioning, the officers informed her that the case would be handed over to higher authorities, including representatives from the palace and possibly even Scotland Yard. Karen's stomach churned at the mention of those names. This wasn't just a minor infraction anymore. It was a full-blown legal issue. As the officers left the room to confer with their superiors, Karen was left alone with her thoughts. She pulled out her phone, still switched off, and stared at it, wishing she could call Mark or anyone who might reassure her that everything would be okay. But she knew better than to ask. For now, she was stuck here, facing the consequences of her impulsive decision. Finally, the door opened again, and a senior official entered. His presence commanded respect, and Karen instinctively straightened in her chair. "Miss Thompson," he began, his voice steady and authoritative, "you are being charged with possession of an offensive weapon in a restricted area and assault on a royal guard. These are serious offenses under British law." Karen's breath hitched. Assault. She hadn't touched anyone. Before she could protest, the official continued. "You will remain detained until your court hearing, which will take place tomorrow morning. Until then, we'll arrange temporary accommodations for you." Court hearing. Temporary accommodations. Karen's head spun. She had never been in trouble with the law before. Not even a parking ticket, and now she was facing actual criminal charges. Panic bubbled inside her, but she forced herself to stay calm. Arguing or breaking down wouldn't help. All she could do was nod and listen as the official outlined the process. When they finally allowed her to see Mark briefly, she burst into tears. "I messed up so badly," she sobbed, clinging to him like a lifeline. Mark hugged her tightly, trying to offer comfort despite his own worry. "We'll figure this out," he promised, though his voice betrayed his uncertainty. As they parted ways, Karen couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change forever. And not in a good way.